If you look at what happened in the 1960s with Marvel, they published an incredible amount of new material that would be the birth of the Marvel Universe. You have Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Iron Man, the Avengers, X-Men. The sheer number of new characters that were created during this time is just phenomenal. In this video, I'm going to talk about some of these scarcer, less-known titles, some of these comic books that I've managed to pick up over the years, and talk about them in the context of where they fit in the 1960s in Marvel Comics. I'm going to do this year by year. I figured this would be kind of a better way to kind of fit how these titles and comic books just kind of appeared in the Marvel Comics universe. Okay, let's jump right in. This is a copy of Tales to Astonish number 14. And this is essentially one of the only comics I have from the year 1960 for Marvel. Marvel at that time really only had what we would call these kind of monster titles, Tales to Astonish, Tales of Suspense, Strange Tales, and Journey into Mystery, as well as these teen or romance titles. 1960 would be considered to be pre-hero Marvel. You'll often hear this kind of term used by collectors. And the reason for this is because, well, there were no superhero comic books published by Marvel at this time. It would not be until the following year in 1961 where Marvel would start to test superhero comic books with the Fantastic Four. But that being said, there are a couple characters that would make their first appearances in 1960 that would later become part of the Marvel Universe. And, one you're probably familiar with, which is Groot. Now, if you were to look at the first appearance of Groot, who appeared in Tales to Astonish number 13, Groot is actually a much different character in that comic book than he is in what we are familiar with in Guardians of the Galaxy. The other character would be the Hulk. Not Dr. Banner, who would transform into this green Goliath smashing machine, but a different character who would later be renamed. I love these old monster books. They have a lot of great artwork by Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, Dick Ayers, and they're a lot of fun to read. This is a copy of Patsy Walker number 93. Now, this is a bit of a cheat. The cover date on this is actually February 1961, but often these comic books were put on the stands before the cover date, and actually this was put out in the stands in October of 1960. Patsy Walker was also kind of, if you look this up in comics.org, it was published under Bard Publishing, and this was, I think, a way that Marvel can get under their 8-title limit that was imposed on them by National, the independent news distributor that were distributing Marvel Comics. Because Marvel didn't have their own distribution system, they relied on independent news to distribute their comics, but they were restricted to only 8 titles a month. So 1961 comes around, and here we have Marvel publish its first superhero comic book, and that's the Fantastic Four. Now, this was a response to what DC was doing at that time. Martin Goodman, who was basically the publisher of Marvel at that time, saw that DC was having some success with the Justice League of America and said to Stan Lee, let's create our own kind of superhero comic book. And that's how the Fantastic Four were created, by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. This is a copy of Tales of Suspense number 24. Marvel were still publishing these kind of monster titles, but this one's kind of neat because if you look in the inside pages, it actually has a very tiny text advertisement for Fantastic Four number 1. So the cover date on this is December of 1961, and I believe Fantastic Four, the cover date is November. Marvel horror titles would slowly start to change from this kind of like monster format to a superhero format, and this would happen in 1962. So I've mentioned the Hulk. And if you look at kind of some of these overstreet price guides in the past, you will often see like little notations of like prototype. But often like the word, how they use prototype is a bit of a, in my opinion, a misnomer, and other collectors feel the same. It's more like it's a prototype name. They would often use or reuse a name that they've used in comic books before to name some of their superheroes, and the Hulk is one of these instances. Now, if you were to look at what the Hulk is on the cover, it's completely different than the Hulk that we're familiar with today. And they would do this a lot with many of the names that they used. This is a copy of Journey into Mystery number 66, and this may be confusing for a lot of people because it has the return of the Hulk. And Zemnu, which is actually the name of this character, is actually kind of a rare occurrence for this time because this was actually a monster that would actually have a second appearance. Zemnu actually appeared in a few issues earlier of Journey to Mystery, published in 1960, and would make a second appearance in 1961. And what's special about this guy as well, too, this character would later be renamed as the Titan and be given a bit of a makeover and be part of the Marvel Universe. He also appeared in Marvel Feature, as well as a couple issues of She-Hulk. So, one of the few rare characters that actually appeared before Fantastic Four #1 that would make it into the Marvel Universe years later. So 1962. Often it takes publishers a while to see if the comic books that they've been publishing have been successful or not. So it may take months before they get information back, basically from sales, to see if maybe one of their stories or one of their titles sold well. In 1962, Marvel started seeing the success that the Fantastic Four was having and decided to do more superhero titles. You would have Ant-Man making his first appearance in Tales to Astonish number 27. You'd have the Hulk, the real Hulk, getting his own title. And then Thor in Journey into Mystery number 83. And this one other character that you might know, as Spider-Man. And Spider-Man first appeared in Amazing Fantasy 15. This is a copy of Strange Tales Annual number 1. And this is actually the first Marvel annual to ever come out. And as you can see on the cover date is 1962. And these had reprints from all their monster titles at that time: Journey into Mystery, Strange Tales, Tales to Astonish, Tales to Suspense. These kind of annuals, very hard to find in nice shape due to their square-bound nature. Essentially, anything before 1965 becomes very difficult to locate in high grade for Marvel comic books. This is a copy of Amazing Adult Fantasy number 13, and this is a reproduction copy. So I thought it was kind of interesting why they choose this one out of all the other issues to reprint. And these came out, I believe, in the 90s, and these are great. Amazing Adult Fantasy is a special title in that Steve Ditko did a ton of artwork on the inside. And I really like the tag on this cover at the bottom. It says, "The magazine that respects your intelligence." 1963 would see Marvel continue its breathtaking pace in creating these new comic book characters that are so iconic today. You'd have Iron Man appear in Tales of Suspense number 39. You'd have the X-Men created, as well as another super team called the Avengers that you're probably very well familiar with. As well, Spider-Man would have his own regular series now, given the success from Amazing Fantasy 15. You'd also have Sergeant Fury, the first war title Marvel would come up with, and Doctor Strange also make his first appearance in Strange Tales number 110. So it's pretty insane to think that in a matter of 2 years, 3 years, if you include at the end of 1961, the sheer number of Marvel classic characters that were created in this short period of time. This is a copy of Kathy number 24, and this came out in 1963. Teen titles were very popular with Marvel. You had Patsy Walker, you had Patsy and Hetty, Kathy, and there was also another title called My Girl Pearl that came out in 1960. I'll show you a copy here that had some artwork that was more along the Dan DeCarlo style of Archie artwork. This cover is also really interesting because it also has caricatures of famous actors as well as personalities from that time. So you have Frank Sinatra, Cary Grant, Elizabeth Taylor, and Ed Sullivan in the background there. I was really happy to find this copy of Kathy number 24 just because I'd never really seen it before. So Very tough, very hard to find in any kind of decent condition. Kathy number 24. Looking at the previous cover of Kathy 24 and modeling with Millie, you would think that maybe Millie and Kathy were sisters. Who knows? Maybe they were. But this is a copy of Modeling with Millie, number 25. So Millie was such a popular character that she actually had more than one title. She had Modeling with Millie, and then she had her regular one, Millie the Model. This title is more along the kind of romance side versus kind of like the Archie style, which was, more geared towards younger readers. So I'm not going to just show obscure Marvel 60s titles, but as well the occasional superhero comic. And I think this one deserves special mention because this is the first Silver Age appearance of Captain America, but not the real Captain America. Now, in the Overstreet price guide, they would often note these kind of prototype characters in their monster titles, but prototype is actually not a great word for these, and I think also it drives some of the collectors crazy because they don't resemble anything like what the future characters that they are, apparently prototyping at all. This is actually a case where I think this is a true prototype because you actually have a fully costumed Captain America appearing in this comic book that predates his first appearance in Avengers number 4. And this is, a great issue because it's also got an early appearance of Doctor Strange. In 1964, we would see what I think is kind of like the last major introduction of a major character, and that would be Daredevil. Daredevil would get his own series, starting with number 1. It's not to say that there aren't other characters that made notable first appearances, but to me, for the longest time, they were kind of secondary, and that would be Black Widow in Tales of Suspense, as well as Hawkeye in the same title. Not to diminish the importance of these two characters in the Marvel Comics universe, but as a collector for the longest time, these two were kind of secondary characters. Marvel did publish these teen and romance titles that are very hard to find for collectors. I did an episode as well, too, about what I found was interesting, that if you look down here, it's actually signed S. Lee and Stan G., which is Stan Lee and Stan Goldberg. And I thought, wow, is it possible that Stan actually did some artwork for the cover? Like, probably not, because he would also kind of sign pages like this in Fantastic Four, in the early issues of Fantastic Four as well. But I thought that was interesting just because it was very uncommon for non-artists to sign any of the covers. But this is an issue of Millie the Model number 123. This is a copy of Millie the Model Annual number 3, dated 1964, 72 big pages. These are harder to find in nice shape. And now, again, this is by no means a high-grade copy, but what's common with these annuals, especially the Millie the Model annuals, is that often the insides would be cut to shreds. Pinups, they had these kind of doll cutouts, so it's more difficult to locate these that are kind of complete because, as well, not a lot of collectors of these Millie titles from the 60s, and so they weren't often kept in the greatest of condition. As well, this time you would start to see Marvel do these split titles. This would happen in Tales of Suspense number 58 with Captain America and Iron Man, and starting after that, they would split the title, as well as Tales to Astonish number 60 with Giant Man and the Hulk. 1964 also, for me, seems to be the year that the Marvel Universe really would start to come together. And I think largely that's on Fantastic Four, because in Fantastic Four you had these milestone issues, like specifically 25-26, where you had the crossover with the Avengers and also the Hulk appearing. And then in subsequent issues, you had a lot of other Marvel characters appear in that title, just to kind of showcase the other characters appearing in other titles at that time. In 1965, you would start to see more titles start to get this kind of split treatment. It was kind of happening before, but it would kind of solidify with a couple more titles. Tales to Astonish, Submariner replaced Giant Man and the Wasp. And in Strange Tales, starting with number 135, Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., would replace the Human Torch and would be the partner for Doctor Strange. Now, the reason why they did this, Marvel certainly wanted to publish more titles, and they were becoming very successful. but their hands were tied because of the distributor that they had a partnership with. At this time, they were only allowed to publish 8 titles a month because of the agreement they had with National. That's basically DC Comics. This would change in 1968, but in 1965, Marvel was really limited in terms of what they can publish. I think, they got away maybe with some of their other titles, their non-superhero titles, just because they were under a different publishing name. I think Bard Publishing published Patsy Walker as an example. So I have a feeling that title kind of was not included in the 8. And what Marvel did as well too is they would publish bi-monthly titles. So they would potentially have up to 16 titles, but some of the titles would be bi-monthly. That being said, Marvel would slowly increase the number of titles that they would be able to push out the door because, sales were good. And, for distributors, they make money by sales as well too. They take, I imagine, a small percentage of the total number of sales. So it's also kind of in their interest. Well, if more stuff sells, then, we can increase the number of titles. I do own some graded books, and this one's kind of an odd one maybe to have graded, but this is Rawhide Kid number 45. If you notice, this is an older label, but I had this graded years ago, and the reason why I had it graded at that time was just because it's got this great Kirby cover, and it also has the origin of the Rawhide Kid. Back in the 60s, Marvel had 3 very popular Western titles: the Rawhide Kid, Kid Cold Outlaw, and the Two Gun Kid. And Larry Lieber did a lot of the heavy lifting for Rawhide Kid. Marvel Westerns in the 60s, especially when you start getting before 1966, 1965, very hard to locate in nice shape. I don't own too many other Marvel Westerns from the 60s. I have a few other issues of Rawhide Kid. The ones I do come across are rarely in anything above 8.0 or very fine. If you want a pretty good challenge, try collecting Marvel Westerns from the 60s. Jumping to 1966, and here we have a copy of Rawhide Kid number 50, which has this great cover where you have the Rawhide Kid dueling Kid Colt. This is one of the few times they actually had a crossover, but the Two Gun Kid would also have the Rawhide Kid make an appearance around the same time. I think this is pretty cool just because it's a way for Marvel to have this kind of shared universe among their Western characters. 1966 saw one of the greatest Fantastic Four story arcs, as well as the introduction of some of the most memorable characters in Fantastic Four lore. That would certainly be Silver Surfer, Galactus, as well as Black Panther. It's also a time that I think DC really started to take notice of Marvel. And, the story goes is that DC, will look at these Marvel comic books and think, oh, they're not the same as the high quality comic books that DC publishes. How are they kind of making these sales, But if you look at the Marvel comic books, they were certainly more kind of down to earth. Are they more realistic? Well, there was a stronger human element to them. And I think really that's what carried Marvel a lot. Here we have a copy of Fantasy Masterpieces number 1, published in 1966. And the first couple issues reprinted the horror titles, the horror monster titles from the earlier 60s, late 50s, Journey to Mystery, Strange Tales. But starting with issue number 3, it would switch gears and start reprinting Golden Age timely books, Captain America, Human Torch, Marvel Mystery. And that was a pretty big deal back then because, even then, timely books were hard to find and they were expensive. So this was an opportunity for readers to read these classic Golden Age stories from Marvel. This issue isn't particularly hard to find in nice shape, but, I just thought it's an interesting title worth mentioning from 1966. One of the greatest Marvel Comics covers ever printed was also published in 1967, and that would be Amazing Spider-Man number 50. 1967, Marvel published Not Brand Decked, which is a humor title that poked fun at their own characters, as well as some characters from other publishers. I always love this cover, actually, but the only thing that I find disappointing about this first issue is that Forbushman really doesn't make much of an appearance in this first issue. A very fun 1967 title, worth taking a look at, even if the humor for back then is a lot different and maybe not quite as funny as now compared to back then. 1968 saw Marvel depart from National's distribution stranglehold and partner with Cadence, and so as a result, there was an explosion of Marvel titles. No longer were they, handcuffed to have like 2 of their characters appear in one title. A lot of new characters entered the Marvel Universe, as well as a lot of Marvel characters got their own titles. So you finally have a lot of major Marvel characters like Iron Man, Submariner, Captain America, the Hulk have their own solo titles. To me, this is like the peak of Marvel Silver Age. You have all these great titles, all these great covers, so many Marvel comic books being published at the same time. Probably the least known title published by Marvel in 1968. This is a copy of Groovy #1. Another humor title, but if you read some of the captions or the comics in this issue, it's just different. Like here, I'll show you the back cover as well too. And some of these now would certainly be deemed inappropriate, especially the one in the bottom left corner. But that's just what it was back then. I also have a copy of Groovy #3. And I think what's kind of interesting is that in this issue, they also do comic book adaptations of popular authors from that time. So, if you read over here from Suzanne Heller's bestseller, More Misery Loves Company. So I thought that's kind of neat. 1968 saw Marvel's first explosion of new titles. And this was actually the first new one in 1968. It's Captain Savage and his Leatherneck Raiders, who first appeared in Sergeant Fury. This title would actually end up, I think, lasting about 18 issues. Marvel at that time really only had Sergeant Fury, and war titles were generally dominated by DC, and the quality of the war titles from DC at that time were better than Marvel. This is a copy of Hulk 102, and this is another one of those examples where Marvel was restarting a bunch of their main characters with new titles. So you had the Incredible Hulk, you had Captain America, Iron Man, Submariner, Captain Marvel, Nick Fury, all given new titles, all in 1968. I was fortunate enough to buy this years ago, and I'm still kind of looking for a couple more of the first issue 1968 titles, but they're very expensive in high grade. Whether I get them or not a big deal, but I am happy to own the first issue of the Hulk in 1968. 1969 would be the start of the decline. After, the explosion of titles in 1968, really, I think you could only go down. And, there were some significant changes that also impacted comic books. Like probably one of the biggest was the increase in price from 12 cents to 15 cents. Now, 15 cents, I think back then was still probably pretty reasonable for a comic book. But you certainly started to see a decline in sales. And this could be attributed to a lot of different things. I think one of them probably is just a competition for space on the newsstands, because you started to see a lot of titles from many different publishers start to crowd the newsstands. And this kind of happened many years ago in the 50s as well, too. A lot of these, kind of creators, publishers, they were making pretty good money, publishing comic books. But, when you have so many different publishers compete for limited space on the newsstands, well, some of these are going to get crowded out. And sometimes it's just hard for kind of people to figure out, what am I going to get this month? In 1969, Marvel really started to flood the newsstands with new titles. I think Martin Goodman, who was the publisher back then, really was not happy with National, with independent news for all those years of, being restricted in terms of what they can publish. Given at that time, like comic books as an industry were starting to struggle a little bit, and this was kind of his way to really push back at DC. He started to publish a lot of new titles, and all over the place. Everything from romance to horror to, this kind of teen humor. And this is a copy of Mad About Millie #1, graded 9.2. A tough book to find in, this kind of grade. Yeah, another Millie the Model title in my collection. Am I the only one out there that collects this stuff? I don't know. Anyways, Mad About Millie #1. I also have to include my copy of Chili #1, which is Millie's red-headed rival. And surprisingly, this lasted like more than 20 issues. The later issues would start to reprint content from the earlier issues, but a very tough book in nice shape. And yeah, Chili #1, 9.2, one of the more scarcer, rarer titles to locate in high grade from the 1960s Marvel. I should note that there's an interesting thing about comic books from the 1960s, specifically Marvel, because once you hit like around 1965, mid-1965 and later, a lot of these Marvel comic books start to be, how would you say, more common in high grade. And one of the reasons why is the Mile High 2 collection purchased by Chuck Rosansky. This was a major warehouse find of comic books, millions of comic books, dating all the way back to like the mid-60s, some of them that were basically in uncirculated high-grade condition. So you will see that after 1965, a lot of Marvel comic books can be found in high grade. But once you get before that, these comic books can be really tough to find in high grade. Like some of them even in low grade, any condition at all. Specifically, like any of those teen kind of romance, Millie the Model books, they are really hard to find in kind of any grade at all. If you enjoyed this video, you can check out another one of my videos talking about 1970s comic books over here. Until next time, enjoy and read your comics.